Why do they have a problem with Trump saying...
it's all fake news. It's phony stuff.
Or...
You are fake news.
Look, first of all, you did have more than 2 clips ready. So
sorry.
My being impressed was prescient.
It was a lie, Glenn. I lied.
That was fake news.
I'm being accountable.
You said was fake news.
All right. What's up, Glenn?
How's it going?
Yeah. how's
Good to be back on your show?
Well, thanks for coming back. Last time we talked was before the election of a certain Mr. Donald Trump. And before we start, I wanted to start out with something you said when you were on last time.
Okay.
If you talk to his supporters, they know that he says outrageous, disgusting things, that he's kind of unstable, that he has been, a lot of ways a joke and a clown. That's what they like about it, because they want to burn the political system down.
So the voters wanted him to burn the system down. Is that what he's doing?
I don't know yet that he's burning the system down, but he's certainly undermining and disrupting it in all sorts of ways. There's a whole variety of categories of controversy that has been created by his presidency, and one of the ones that I find most trivial and almost positive and entertaining is this notion that he is breaching protocols and violating standard practices of how presidents are supposed to engage in certain behaviors. This is exactly what I think his voters were most intent on seeing him do, which is that they think that there's this system in Washington, this culture of politics that systematically ignores them when it's not destroying their future and their security, and they have good reasons for thinking that. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to see it vandalized, degraded. And I think he was their instrument, their agent, and to some significant extent, I think just in the 2 months that he's been president, you do see a lot of that already.
So, what has been the most surprising thing in the first 2 months of his presidency for you? Like, what did you not expect of his presidency?
Interestingly, I think he has adhered pretty closely to most of what he said he intends to do. I wrote an article just yesterday, in fact, about the fact that he has significantly increase the number of civilians being killed by U.S. airstrikes, both in Iraq and Syria, as well as in Yemen, and pointed out that although he ran as an opponent of interventions, of the kind of regime change interventions or humanitarian interventions of which the U.S. has become so fond in places like Iraq and Libya and Syria, he also vowed repeatedly that he would unleash the U.S. military, liberate them from what he regarded as constraints in terms of rules of engagement, that basically he wanted to fight the wars that the U.S. fights in a more savage, barbaric, and criminal way by slaughtering civilians indiscriminately. And that appears to be exactly what he's doing. In fact, there was a video of him speaking to a campaign rally where he said, and I quote, "I'm going to bomb the shit out of ISIS." So I think that there's a lot of what people are acting shocked about that in one sense is shocking because it's very extreme and aberrational for what normally takes place in Washington. But I think most of what he's doing, both stylistically and substantively, is what he signaled he was going to do over the last 18 months.
So I wanted to play another excerpt of our last interview where you talked about how...
You came so prepared today.
I have only 2 clips. This is it.
This
is the other one.
Right.
I worry with a Trump victory as much about him running wild as I do the fact that these kind of ideas that people have for how he can be stopped would start to create more problems than they're trying to solve.
So you kind of predicted what happened after he got elected, that people in Washington and what people call the deep state tried to stop him. Can you elaborate for our listeners and viewers, like how that is still going on?
Sure. I had 2 things in mind with that. The first was that there were a lot of Democrats and liberals openly flirting with the notion that if Trump did win, that they were hoping for what they were essentially describing as intervention by the deep state, in meaning this permanent power faction that resides in Washington and exerts power regardless of the outcome of elections. The people in the intelligence community, the CIA, the NSA, the Pentagon, that stay in Washington decades as presidents come and go, and therefore exercise a huge amount of power. In fact, in some senses, more power than even the elected officials exercise. There was a hope on the part of Democrats, expressed quite openly, that if Trump won, that faction would use its dark arts to subvert him, essentially to undermine the democratic process and to prevent an elected president from carrying out an agenda or from even remaining in office. What you're essentially talking about there is a coup, either a hard coup or a soft coup of the kind that the U.S. has engendered in so many other countries that you saw lots of liberals and Democrats before the election hoping would take place and now are actively cheering as it does. And no matter how dangerous you think the Trump presidency is, and I think it's actually quite dangerous in a lot of ways, including how I wrote about yesterday, it's at least equally dangerous to hope that the precedent is created where the deep state interferes in U.S. domestic politics and in our democracy and imposes the outcomes it prefers that were contrary to the wishes of the voters as expressed in the election. The other component of this kind of dangerous reaction to Trump that I had in mind, and I think has maybe been even more toxic, is this obsession with finding Russian infiltration in Washington, very similar to how in the 1950s and 1960s, the obsession of the FBI and the CIA and congressional committees was to find Kremlin infiltration in the United States. It's this long-standing American paranoia that Moscow is trying to control U.S. politics. And to do so, they take very banal incidents like they did in the 50s and 60s, where very isolated people having some affiliation in their past with the Communist Party and converting that using paranoia and derangement into this broad-scale Russian plot to take over the United States. And you see it almost verbatim repeating itself, even though the ideology of Russia has changed. And this fixation with demonizing everything Russian, every meeting, anytime any American meets with or speaks to a Russian, it's evidence of their disloyalty or suggestions about their nefarious intent, is extremely dangerous, given that Russia is still a nuclear-armed power with more nuclear weapons in its arsenal than every other country, including the United States, with the two countries still with hair-trigger systems that could set off nuclear Armageddon, with a fair amount of ease, with them having military deployments very close to one another in multiple hotspots around the world. It's extremely dangerous internationally to try and inflame these U.S.-Russian tensions, and even domestically, it's very dangerous, as history has proven, to start looking under every rock and every under pillow and under your bed for lurking Russian agents. But that's what the Democratic Party, in the name of resisting Trump, has really become.
So, I mean, German mainstream media kind of treat the Russian involvement in the American election as a fact now. It seems to be that a lot of American media does the same. Do you treat it as a fact that Russia changed the election so Trump could win?
No, not at all. I mean, first of all, you have to distinguish between what that even means to say that Russia interfered in the election. Does it mean that among the people hacking the emails of the DNC and John Podesta were people who are Russian nationals? Does it mean that among that group of hackers who are responsible for that were people in Russia? Or does it mean, that Vladimir Putin actually sat in the Kremlin and personally directed that the DNC emails and John Podesta's emails be hacked based on some kind of a theory that Donald Trump would be helped by driving a wedge between Sanders supporters and Clinton supporters, that Putin or the highest levels of the Kremlin were literally thinking in those ways? So there's a huge universe between those two poles, and there's a lot of space in between, all of which has become completely conflated and blurred. We're all now just supposed to accept not only that the people involved in the hacking were Russians, meaning Russian nationals, but that it was the Russian government, the Russian intelligence services at the highest level that specifically and explicitly directed this with the expressed intent of helping elect Donald Trump. There's no evidence, literally, for any of that has been presented by the U.S. government. They keep asserting that Russia is responsible for the hacks. We're all supposed to believe it. Everyone keeps asserting it over and over. I certainly don't think it's implausible. It would not shock me or surprise me if it turned out to be true. But I think that as skeptical human beings and as journalists and as citizens, we ought to demand to see evidence before we believe it, given the capacity for human deceit and human error. But then there's, I think, the broader question of whether this was just sort of banal hacking with banal intentions to destabilize or to disrupt or to discover information of the kind that the United States engages in regularly toward Russia and pretty much every other country in the world, or whether this was some really active, specific plot to help elect Donald Trump. And I think there's been no evidence presented of the latter. There's a lot of conspiracy theorists asserting it, but really no evidence of it.
I'm glad your dogs are okay.
They're excited by this topic. Well, let's just hold on 1 second because someone's actually arriving, which is why they're so excited. In a second, they'll calm down.
You just said conspiracy theory. Isn't this Russia thing a mainstream conspiracy theory? Because it's, as you said, there's no evidence yet.
I found it really bizarre because Western media in the US and the UK and Germany love to mock all sorts of other people for peddling conspiracy theories. They love to mock the Arab world for conspiracies. They love to mock Russian state media for conspiracies. They love to mock fringe right-wing sites like InfoWars for engaging in conspiracies. And all of those venues do occasionally feature conspiracies for sure. But U.S. mainstream media and Western mainstream media love conspiracies every bit as much. But because it becomes mainstream, they don't think of it as the same kind of conspiracy. They're like respectable conspiracy theories. So the U.S. literally went to war, invaded a country of 26 million people based on a classic conspiracy theory that Saddam Hussein not only had nuclear weapons, but was in a secret alliance with Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. And the journalists in the U.S. who published that conspiracy theory of an alliance between Saddam and Osama bin Laden, a completely fabricated, made-up theory, not only never suffered any professional accountability or consequences, but they've been consistently promoted within the U.S. mainstream media. In fact, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic magazine, one of the most mainstream magazines in the United States, he just became editor-in-chief, is Jeffrey Goldberg, who spent 2002 and 2003 laundering that theory in places like The New Yorker. So conspiracy theories are completely acceptable and even admired in Western mainstream discourse as long as they're aimed at the right people. And so now you see all kinds of claims, not just about Russia having hacked the election, but also about the Trump administration or the then Trump campaign having colluded with the Kremlin in order to hack into these emails, in order to release the information in a way that would harm the Clinton campaign, for which there's literally no evidence. And yet you have people on major cable networks, you have people on Twitter who have seen their following explode because they do nothing all day but sit around, in their view, connecting the dots, which is what Glenn Beck used to do in 2009 and 2010 at his chalkboard, where he would connect all the dots between Obama and, Common Cause and left-wing financiers and international organizations in this crazed, frenzied way that liberals mock. This is what they've become. But it's much more mainstream than Glenn Beck was. Glenn Beck was always pretty fringe, even though he had a large audience on Fox.
Right.
But now you see these conspiracy theorists being heralded by the most mainstream news organizations in a way that I think that will have very enduring harm.
You just mentioned Glenn Beck. Did you see the Rachel Maddow fiasco almost 2 weeks ago? That kind of reminded me of Glenn Beck, like this whole connecting the dots thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Rachel Maddow, although extremely smart, and although she started off as a pretty careful journalist, I used to do her show all the time on Air America and also on MSNBC when it began, has really transformed into a Glenn Beck figure, who Glenn Beck-like figure, who, by the way, is also very smart and shrewd. I wouldn't put them in the same category. I think Rachel is still much more kind of rational than Glenn Beck at his worst moments was.
I was just saying,
I think
she reminded me of him, like her show that.
No, absolutely. No, it's a fever. It's a collective mania. I mean, I think one of the things that I think often gets overlooked because of the day-to-day immersion in political discourse on Twitter and Facebook and cable news 24 hours a day is just what a shock to the political system Donald Trump's election was. Not only because he's such an outlier in terms of his behavior and ideology and background and experience, and not only because of the profound indictment it presents for the U.S. political system, much like Brexit presented for the British political system, but also because of the way in which it happened. I mean, all of the self-proclaimed data geniuses were telling everybody that Hillary Clinton's chances of winning were 96.4% or 93.7% with great exactitude and precision, leading everyone to believe that her election was basically a fait accompli up until the night of the election. And so it wasn't just the shock to the system of what happened, but also how it happened. And although it seems like an eternity since Trump has won, it's only been 5 months since he won and 3 months since he's been inaugurated, or not even, less than that. And I think that people have become extremely disoriented by these events, still can't quite grapple with what happened or how it happened, are still very scared of what it means, and they're just grappling around for explanations, things that can make sense of it all. And when people are confused and frightened and looking for explanations, that's when charlatans and grifters and opportunists can exploit it by feeding them conspiracies and all-encompassing explanations of hidden villains and ways to process what has taken place in a way that soothes the people who are searching for explanations and redounds to the benefit greatly of the people who are feeding them what they need. So the people who are engaging in these conspiracies, Rachel Maddow's ratings are through the roof. The people on social media who sit around connecting these bullshit dots all day, of Trump being a Manchurian candidate implanted by the Kremlin back in the 1980s and the like. They had 3,000 Twitter followers 6 months ago, and now they have 180,000 Twitter followers. They have GoFundMe accounts that get filled up with people thinking their work is so important. And so it's this kind of synergistic cycle that we saw after Obama won, and the right was shocked and hysterical about what it meant, and Fox News and right-wing radio exploded in popularity. The same thing is now happening, but in reverse.
I was going to come to that point because, like, in 2009, Obama came into power, and the right wing was like, he's a Muslim, he's a communist, and he's going to destroy our country. Now, 8 years later, Trump is in office, and he's not a communist, but he's a Russian guy, and he's going to destroy our country. So
yeah, for me, I think like perhaps an even better analogy is what happened in the early 1990s when Bill Clinton won. And at the time, Bill Clinton was regarded as this really kind of alienating, polarizing outsider figure. Hillary actually was regarded as this great threat because she was a feminist and an independent, strong woman. And so culturally, the Clintons represented this really severe shock to the political culture of the United States. And that was really when the fever swamps of the right wing were born and grew. That was when Fox News became popular. That was when Rush Limbaugh took off and exploded. It was when the Judge Report was created that led to impeachment and the Lewinsky scandal. The right went completely insane. And one of the things that they were obsessed with was the idea that the Clintons routinely had their political opponents or critics murdered. And there were all these websites about Clinton body counts. The Wall Street Journal op-ed page constantly speculated that Vince Foster, the lawyer close to the Clintons who committed suicide, was in fact murdered by Hillary Clinton. This was an obsessive conspiracy on the part of even mainstream organs on the right for a long time. They were just fixated on this notion that the Clintons were these omnipotent villains causing the deaths of all their political opponents in order to cover up all their wrongdoing that was just about to be exposed by the people that they had murdered. And if you look at Democratic Party discourse now about Trump and Putin, it's the same thing. Anytime anyone with any remote connection to Russia dies, Democratic pundits use that conspiratorial language. They have no basis for thinking that the person was murdered, that it was done by the Kremlin or by Trump, but they insinuate and imply it constantly. They have Putin body counts and Trump body counts. And it really reminds me of the same thing, this mania that comes from just having all of your certainties completely uprooted and then having people prey on your fears and confusion about the world.
So 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, Trump claimed that Obama wiretapped him, and the public is laughing at Trump for that. But I was thinking, like, isn't Trump kind of right when you look at the NSA spying and all that? Wouldn't it mean that the NSA had like a negative filter for, okay, we're not gonna surveil Trump? Or
so the reason there was so much confusion surrounding that discussion, including confusion on the part of Trump, is because of the lies that the U.S. government has continuously told in order to deceive Americans about what actually takes place inside the NSA.
Right.
So when we first started doing the Snowden reporting, not only President Obama, but also key Republican leaders tried to reassure Americans that they had nothing to fear from the NSA. And what they said in order to give this reassurance was a complete falsehood. They said, if you're an American citizen, you have nothing to worry because we cannot eavesdrop on your telephone calls or read your emails without a warrant. Now, this is a bizarre thing to say for the world because, as Mark Zuckerberg pointed out, who obviously wants to have people around the world, not just Americans, use Facebook, it's a really terrible message to send, which is the message they were sending. Look, if you're an American, we respect your privacy. But if you're 95% of the world called non-Americans, we don't. We listen in on whatever we want, which is basically true. But even with regard to Americans, what President Obama and Republican leaders said was an absolute lie. The NSA constantly listens to the phone calls of Americans and reads the emails of Americans without first getting warrants. The way they do it is that the law in 2008 that was passed under the Bush administration says that if the NSA targets a foreign national and an American citizen talks with that foreign national, the NSA can continue to listen to that American's call, even though an American is now on the call, without first getting a warrant. And although the law bars the practice of what's called reverse targeting, which is where you specifically and purposely target somebody who's a foreign national when your real intention is to listen to an American's call, there are so many loopholes and so many ways around it that even the NSA in 2008 admitted that a core purpose of this law was to be able to scoop up Americans' calls and emails without first getting warrants. And so it is true that the NSA constantly listens to the calls and reads the emails of Americans without first getting warrants. It's called incidental collection. And that was the confusion that Trump was exploiting. So it is very possible that, you know, it's obviously a normal thing if you're the president-elect of the United States that you talk to foreign leaders, or if you're a candidate for president, a major candidate, you talk to foreign officials. As we know from the Merkel story, from the story here in Brazil about spying on Dilma, let alone all the spying on Russians and everything else, it is extremely probable that the NSA at some point when Trump's speaking to foreign officials or his top aides listen to those conversations. Those conversations are being leaked to the media. They're being leaked to people in Washington. They've become the sort of rumor mill and the gossip mill in Washington. And so Trump has a kernel of a point, even though what he said was probably false, in that his calls and the calls of his closest associates were probably listened to and are now being used against him. And you can certainly think that he should be investigated and still think that that's concerning.
So just to, before I forget it, those hacks of DNC, Podesta and all that, you said it's possible that the Russians did it, but is there any other scenario, like maybe someone else did it? Do you have any other theories? Any other theories out there?
I could speculate endlessly. There's an endless number of possibilities. I mean, one of the things that both the NSA and Russian intelligence agencies do that they're really good at doing is they track hackers. So assume there's some non-state collective of hackers, black hat hackers who hack for nefarious reasons or even mixed reasons. The NSA, the FSB, and other intelligence agencies around the world track what they're doing. So they monitor these hackers so that when those hackers start to exfiltrate and steal information, the NSA and Russian intelligence agencies have access to the same information. So it's possible that independent hackers hacked John Podesta and the DNC's emails, and the Russians got the information that way. It's possible someone else did it, and the Russians are being blamed. It's possible somebody else did it and made it look like the Russians were doing it. We know for sure that the NSA and the CIA, when they hack, often try and create artificial trails to make it look like someone else did it, including potentially the Russians. So I'm not saying I think any of that happened here, but I'm saying that there's so many plausible scenarios. It's certainly plausible that the Russians did it. It's plausible that lots of other people did it as well. And for that reason, we ought to see the evidence presented by the U.S. government to substantiate their repeated claims, their repeated assertions that it's Russia that's responsible. The one other thing I would say is that if you look at the intelligence community, there has been some dissent inside the intelligence community about some of these theories. There does seem to be a broad consensus that, broadly speaking, the Russians, whatever that means, were involved in the hacking. But even on the question of why they did it, the CIA and the FBI say that they have high confidence that the Russians did it with the intention of helping Donald Trump win the election. The NSA rejected that finding and said we only have moderate confidence that that was the reason. The Washington Post article, the first one that reported about the belief of the intelligence agencies, noted that there was dissent and discrepancies about their findings on what the Post called minor issues, although it didn't specify what those issues are. So for me, once Washington starts making claims but doesn't accompany those claims with evidence, I'm going to be skeptical until the evidence is seen and try and urge as many other people as possible to join in that skepticism.
So after Trump was elected, on that day, everybody was shocked. The Western world was shocked. Journalists, mainstream journalists were shocked. Back then, I kind of wondered if political journalists are going to think over their approach of covering politics. I mean, we agreed that the election cycle was the ultimate reality TV. Why has political journalism not changed? Like, why didn't your colleagues, like, well, maybe we did something wrong. They're just doing the same thing all over again now, attacking Trump.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it is sort of bizarre that people were so shocked that Trump won, in one sense, because we saw the model for what would happen with Brexit. And I was far from the only person who pointed that out. I mean, lots of people at the time when Brexit happened, and the political class in London was shocked by it, even though at least the difference is with Brexit, the polling data was pretty close all along. And the political and media elites just decided that it couldn't possibly happen because they were so convinced that it was so terrible. They just didn't believe it would ever happen.
Right.
Whereas in the U.S., the polling data up until the election was pretty consistent that Clinton had a sizable lead, and so the shock is a little bit more rationally understandable. On the other hand, Brexit was the model for showing that when you destroy the economic security of tens of millions of people in your middle class and working class through neoliberal policies, eventually you're going to get serious instability and unpredictability in how they react and respond. And I think the same political trends that explained Brexit were the ones that explained Trump's election as well. And given how Brexit had just happened months earlier, we should not have been particularly surprised. The other aspect that I think is important is that polling data gets treated as though it's scientific because it is the hardest empirical data that we have. But so many assumptions go into polling science about who is going to vote, who is sufficiently motivated, what the likelihood is of different groups to vote and the regions in which they're going to vote, that there is a huge amount of subjectivity in it. And not just polling firms, but also political pundits really are out of touch with the sentiments of the ordinary American for socioeconomic and political and geographic reasons. Polling data is supposed to bridge that gap, right? It's supposed to say, you pundits don't have to speculate. We're going to scientifically survey these populations that you never interact with, and we're going to show you through data what it is that they believe. But there's so much subjectivity inherent in that data, in those methodologies, that they are almost as unreliable as punditry itself, as we just saw. And I think the reason why people haven't changed is because, as I said earlier, U.S. media is the most accountability-free profession that exists on the planet. You can not only be wrong, but humiliatingly and tragically wrong over and over and over again. And as long as you're wrong in the mainstream way, as long as you're wrong by pronouncing the conventional wisdom or for what's perceived as the right cause, being wrong is not a black mark against you. In fact, it's almost something in your favor. The way that you advance in U.S. journalism is by saying what powerful people believe and what they want said. And as long as you do that, you're going to keep getting promoted over and over and over, regardless of how wrong you are. And to see how true that is, just look at who the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic is.
So if the American press is accountability free, why do they have a problem with Trump saying...
it's all fake news. It's phony stuff.
Or...
You are fake news.
Look, first of all, you did have more than 2 clips ready. So
sorry.
My being impressed was prescient.
It was a lie, Glenn. I lied.
That was fake news.
I'm being accountable.
Fake news. Yes. No, so I think that there's not very much. This whole concept of fake news and Trump's war in the media, the way that this gets discussed is we're all supposed to express shock and horror that there's fake news and that people are willing to be open to believing it. We're all supposed to be shocked and horrified that Trump is ginning up hatred for the media, but we almost never ask why those things happen. Why have so many people lost so much faith in the credibility of mainstream media institutions that when they see, CBS.com or the WashingtonPost.com, to them, that's no more credible or maybe even less credible than some made up URL of a media organization that doesn't exist and that they've never heard of before? Or why is it such an effective strategy for politicians to run against the media? Why do people hate the media so much? This question never gets asked. And the reason it never gets asked is because just like Democrats in the election, the reason they're blaming Putin and the New York Times and Jill Stein and Susan Sarandon is because by blaming everybody else, casting doubt on and aspersion on everybody else, you get to avoid self-accountability, asking what you did wrong. The same exact thing is true of why the media loves to denounce fake news and denounce Trump's war in the media without ever asking why it's effective. And the reason it's effective is because people have lost faith in media institutions. And the reason they've lost faith in media institutions is precisely because there's no accountability. People know that the media routinely spreads bullshit, routinely spreads lies, routinely spreads ideologically driven fabrications. And when they get caught, they don't acknowledge it. They're not accountable to anybody. They just move on to the next one. And when you keep doing that over and over and over, you're going to lose credibility. And when you lose credibility, things like fake news and Trump's war in the media are going to be fueled. And so in a lot of ways, the things that the media is most upset about, the proliferation of fake news, Trump's war in the media, are really their own doing.
But business is still doing great. The New York Times, their subscriber numbers are going up. As you said, Rachel Maddow's show is doing great ratings. Maybe they don't need being right. They just need to do some news about Trump.
Right. Well, the incentive scheme for cable news has obviously always been, it doesn't matter how much credibility you have or if you have any, as long as you're feeding enough people what they want to hear, you're going to make a huge profit. That's been the model of Fox News, right? Everybody for 20 years, all the smart people, all the elite scoff at Fox News, talk about how Fox News is a propaganda channel. Same with Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh's a liar. Rush Limbaugh's an idiot. Rush Limbaugh's this. Rush Limbaugh's that. And all Fox News and Rush Limbaugh have done for 20 years is make more and more money and have their ratings increase and increase and increase, especially when they can scare enough people, when Clinton wins, when Obama wins. CNN has been regarded as a huge joke for at least 2 decades, and yet CNN is incredibly profitable as well. So if you're a Democratic Party pundit like Rachel Maddow or people on MSNBC, or if you're, the New York Times that has been struggling financially, the incentive scheme. The incentive scheme is that journalistic integrity, journalistic accountability, journalistic accuracy does not produce any benefits for you. Quite the opposite, in fact. If you're not feeding people what they want, if you're not capitalizing on their fears, you're probably not going to make money. And so the incentive is for Rachel Maddow to go on the air every night and scare the shit out of everybody about how Russia has taken over Washington so that she can be their guardian. She can be their protector. She's getting to the bottom of this conspiracy and will expose it and save them. And people love that. They feel like they're being protected and someone's watching out for them, right? That's what Bill O'Reilly has pitched to his audience forever. I'm the one watching out for you. Donald Trump stood in front of the Republican National Convention and said, I will be your voice. This is, the motto of carnival barkers and charlatans forever, is to pose as the people's champion, when in reality they're exploiting the very people they're purporting to defend. And so you see a lot of people in the media now knowing that elites and coastal residents in San Francisco and New York and Washington and Los Angeles, the people with advertising dollars and who are their targets, are petrified of Trump. And if you feed that, the benefits will come in huge amounts. And a lot of people are capitalizing.
But how do we get out of that vicious cycle? How do we make those mainstream media don't do that?
So I don't know that you can make them not do it. I think what you can do is you can offer alternatives. You can find ways to create different models that will be successful. I think that one of the alternative paths is to try and have credibility among not just one faction where you just constantly preach to the choir, but credibility among multiple factions, because they're convinced that you don't have such overarching loyalty to a particular party or ideology that you're willing even to lie in service of it, that you're willing to tell the truth regardless of which faction it hurts. There are some journalists, Jake Tapper on CNN is actually a really good example. He's respected across the ideological spectrum because he's a really aggressive, hard interviewer, whether he's interviewing Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell or a Trump official or a Clinton campaign official. People trust him to tell the truth and to say this story's a lie, no matter who it helps or no matter who it hurts. There are some online outlets. That's certainly what we at the Intercept try and do. And I think that we have a very diverse audience. We're very unique in that regard. We don't just have an audience loyal to a particular party or particular ideology, but people who read the Intercept knowing that we're going to speak what we believe is truthful, regardless of the implications. And that's how I think you start rebuilding trust in media, is by showing people that you're willing to tell the truth, no matter what the consequences are for a particular politician or a particular party.
So what is the incentive scheme of the Intercept?
Well, one of the because of how we're funded, which is we have a single funder, and we're constituted as a nonprofit. So not only aren't we expected to make profit, we're legally barred from making profit, which means in turn that we don't have advertisers who we have to satisfy. We don't actually have the commercial imperatives that often corrupt and undermine journalism. We're able to take young reporters who we pay a very good wage and tell them to go off and investigate a particular story for 2 months and disappear and not produce clickbait and not generate any traffic, even though they're still on full salary, because we don't have these commercial imperatives. There are certainly hazards and dangers to being funded by a single, billionaire. So it's far from ideal. In our case, we obtain guarantees of full independence that have been completely honored, but that won't always be true. So there's no perfect model. But because of how we're funded and because of the lack of commercial pressures we have, we feel like we're totally free to devote ourselves to the journalistic mission without regard to who it angers, without having to cultivate a really hardcore partisan base that only wants their assumptions continually reinforced, or to serve a particular agenda. We're really free to engage in journalism without those kinds of artificial considerations, and I think it's a huge benefit to how we're structured.
Have you guys changed your reporting or your style of reporting ever since Trump got into power? Is the Intercept covering Trump differently than Obama's presidency?
I don't think so. I think the Intercept is intended to be structured to be adversarial to whoever wields power. I think the question of who wields power is often a murkier one than it is simple. obviously, to some extent, whoever the president is wields a great amount of power, and that person is now Donald Trump. But there are lots of factions in opposition to Trump that also wield a great amount of power. If you look, for example, at who is unified behind the idea that Russia has infiltrated American politics, it's not just Democrats, but the mainstream media, the CIA, the deep state, other countries. That unified group of actors also wields a great amount of power. And so I don't think that being adversarial to power should mean that we just mindlessly scream and yell only about Trump on the grounds that he's the only one who wields power. There's lots of corporate power. There's lots of lobbyist power. There's lots of permanent power that exists independent of elections. We just saw Trump get defeated on his health care bill. We've seen Trump have his Muslim ban stopped. We've seen Trump's lies exposed. There's lots of powerful actors that are checking Trump. So obviously we're going to be in opposition to Trump when we believe that what he's doing is deceitful or destructive. But we're not going to be mindlessly in opposition to him just to prove to Democrats that we're good. We're going to continue to report in an adversarial way against everybody who wields any kind of political or economic power.
Are you guys sending a reporter to the press briefings in the White House?
I know we had plans to a few weeks ago. We were in the process of getting credentialed. I don't know if we've started. I don't know if we've yet done that. We're kind of two minds on that. On the one hand, it's a great opportunity to ask questions that might otherwise not get asked. On the other hand, press briefings are a huge farce. And it's just sort of the consummate way of doing insider reporting, meaning you're literally inside the White House. And we tend to think that the better way to do reporting is by staying on the outside of power, getting information from disaffected factions within the government, as opposed to people at the seat of power. So I don't know what ultimately got decided there. I know we were in the process of obtaining credentials, though.
I mean, if I remember correctly, like the relationship between the White House press corps and the Obama administration kind of seemed like they're friends. Now it's the complete opposite. They seem to be antagonistic, even enemies. But I mean, when Obama was seemingly friends with the Washington press corps, I didn't think that was a good idea, because the media is supposed to check power, check the executives, and I kind of like the situation now that they're very antagonistic, that they actually almost hate each other. Because
that's how it's supposed to be, right? And it is so bizarre because I started writing in 2005 during the Bush presidency, and a major factor in my stopping on writing about politics is I thought the political media was doing such a poor job in checking the Bush administration because there was no adversarial relationship of the kind that you just described. It was incredibly deferential, incredibly subservient. And then into the Obama administration, it actually got worse. The press was even more in love with Obama pretty much throughout his 8 years in office than they were with Bush in the wake of 9/11, which was already a pretty pornographic love affair. And it only got worse during Obama. So my media criticism for the past 12 years has been essentially urging the media to do exactly what they're now finally doing. So I'm thrilled to see the media so antagonistic and so hostile. I just seriously wonder, whether this is just a kind of one-off, unique response to Trump because of what an outside force he is, because of how kind of disrespectful he is of Washington traditions, because of how much he obviously hates the media, then it is an actual behavioral change that will endure. I think that really remains to be seen. It's not just the hatred and the antagonistic tone. The media actually started doing things and acting like it was some kind of special achievement, like Donald Trump would say something and they would just explicitly say, this is false, this is a lie, this did not happen. Patting themselves on the back as though they're doing something really special, when that's really like the core function of what the media is supposed to be, which is exactly what they didn't do and wouldn't do under both Bush and Obama and even before that. So whether this really ushers in a behavioral change on the part of a new generation of journalists who now see their relationship to political power differently, I hope so, but I have serious doubts.
I hope so too. So what are the chances of Glenn Greenwald interviewing Donald Trump?
Probably pretty low,
Really?
mostly because Trump seems to only... Trump is like a very kind of cliched American consumer of news. I think the way he gets his news is by watching cable TV. He loves CNN. He loves Fox. And then also because he grew up in New York and lives in New York, the New York Times always sort of has a special role in his psyche. So I don't think he spends much time reading alternative perspectives, searching the internet for dissident views. I don't think he's a big consumer of new media. So I think like when he goes to satisfy his ego for media attention, for him that means having CNN, Fox, and the New York Times talk about him. It's not something I've ever tried to do. I've never asked for an interview like that. I certainly would love to do it, just like I would have loved to do it and still would for Obama. But I just think given Trump's purview of how he evaluates media, I think it is unlikely.
Maybe you should disguise as a Fox News reporter or something.
Exactly. I'll pretend to be Sean Hannity.
One last thing. I wanted to congratulate you guys on starting your podcast, Intercepted.
Yeah, we basically did it to crush your show. That
thanks.
was the main strategic reason. So I feel like it's off to a good start.
It is. Like, who came up with the idea? Jeremy is doing a fantastic job.
Yeah, he all along, everyone knows him as this really crusading war correspondent and investigative journalist, which of course he is. But lurking within all of that was this very talented and passionate and creative host of a podcast. And the response has genuinely been amazing. I think the number of downloads and subscribers that we have as of today is something like 12 or 13 times greater than even our best case scenario estimates anticipated. It's become a huge sensation. And the way he puts the shows together is very unique in terms of the guest lists and the diversity of topics and the approaches to talk about them. I love to make fun of Jeremy and to mock him. He's like my brother. We fight like that. But I can't even in jest think of anything bad to say. It's really been this smashing success. And he's really very good at it.
But why do you guys do ads on the podcast?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't even know what the ads are. I don't know what the arrangement is. I know that we've talked in the past about finding ways to generate different streams of revenue to support our journalism so that we're not entirely dependent upon one publisher. I don't know if that's a start. I just don't know what the arrangement is. You have to ask him.
And one last final question, since I was prepared, as you said, about Snowden. Could he be in danger because maybe Trump and Putin make a deal about him?
It's possible, of course, but I haven't seen any evidence for it. The person who's actually been pushing this idea most is Hillary Clinton's most vocal CIA surrogate, Mike Morell, who ran the CIA under Obama. He actually wrote a column urging Trump who he had previously denounced as a Russian asset.
He is like, as I said to you, the German Interior Minister and the German spy agencies are of the same opinion. Even the leading editor of Germany's largest newspaper just said it.
Germany and Russia always have a very kind of unique fixation with one another historically and contemporaneously. So that doesn't surprise me. But it was actually Mike Morell who said that, and this is really funny. He wrote a column. He said in I believe January or early February, saying Trump should reach a deal with Putin for Putin to give Snowden as a gift to Trump because it'll make Trump look strong.
Wow. And
it'll also fix Trump's problems with the intelligence community because the intelligence community has a deep hatred for Snowden, and on the top of their wish list is to have Snowden in a prison cell. So Mike Morell said to Trump, you should do this. It'll help you in all these different ways. It'll make you look like a winner. It'll make you look strong, trying to manipulate him and play on his insecurities. And the Kremlin came out and really viciously mocked Mike Morell for saying this. They said, first of all, you say that you're an intelligence agent, but you don't know very much about what's going on because unbeknownst to you, apparently, just 3 weeks ago, we extended Snowden's residency rights in Russia for another 3 years. So we obviously don't intend for him to go anywhere. And then they said, obviously with at least a little bit of trolling in mind, what you just wrote reveals some really dark aspects of your character, given that you view human beings as something that ought to be traded as gifts. We in Russia don't see human beings in those terms, but you obviously do. So they were pretty scathing in their rejection of that kind of a proposal. Putin seems pretty invested in the idea that he's going to uphold international law and rights because of the propaganda benefits it gives him, and that there's no mechanism to give back Snowden. I'm sure there's some deal that could be reached where he could be persuaded to change his mind, but I think it would take a great deal, and I haven't seen any evidence that that's happening, though it wouldn't shock me if it did.
Glenn, thanks so much.
Great to talk.
Next time you talk to Ed, send our regards from my team and myself.
Totally will.
And talk to you soon.
All right, great. Thank you.
Thanks.